We want to talk a little bit about the business of stress and how it affects physical health and emotional or mental health. Most people are pretty familiar with the idea of stress. It's kind of hard to get away from, and it's real common to hear people talk about how they feel stressed, how today is a real stressful day, or how they're under financial stress, or there's a lot of stress in their home or at work, or whatever it might be. We're no strangers to this idea. People have an interesting variety of methodologies for dealing with stress. Some people have a reliance on chemical ways of dealing with stress. Maybe it's alcohol, maybe it's prescription drugs, tranquilizers, whatever it might be. Other people try to reduce their stress or handle their stress in other ways, some more effective than others. A lot of people don't realize that stress is pretty important for life. If we had no stress at all, we'd probably not accomplish much of anything in our lives. Too much stress, and we break down. There's an optimal level of stress in which we are alert and active and capable and perform well, but if stress gets too high, then our performance begins to fall off. The physiology of stress is really fascinating. The little almond-sized and shaped structure in the center of the brain, labeled amygdala here in this diagram, is sort of like the early warning system for things that might go wrong. The amygdala is kind of always on alert, always looking around, always filtering perceptions that come in from the surrounding environment, looking for threats. And whenever the amygdala sees something that is a threat or even that might be a threat, it sounds the alarm bells and sets off the whole stress cascade. It sends signals to the hypothalamus, which then sends signals to the pituitary, which sends signals down to the adrenal glands, and it starts a hormonal cascade that alerts the whole body and gets everything going. It also has the effect of, in a sense, kind of taking over the whole nervous system, so that the prefrontal cortex, which is ordinarily involved with things like logic and reasoning, gets handicapped by the hormone cascade that's taking place in the body. And so this is not a good time for the body to try to do some logical thinking. Somebody said one time that it is the role of the amygdala to put the body on hyper alert, and it's the role of the rest of the brain to tell the amygdala to sit down and shut up. Otherwise, we would constantly be overreacting to everything that we perceive to be a threat or a possible threat. Because stress is essentially the process of putting the whole body on alert in order to save the body's life, it has an effect on just about every body system. This diagram shows the various body systems that are affected and some of the key ways in which they react. For example, the nervous system, obviously, when stressed, either physically because there is a real threat there, or psychologically, suddenly shifts its energy resources to fighting off the perceived stress. In what is known as the fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system signals the adrenal glands to release adrenaline and cortisol. These hormones make the heart beat faster, raise the blood pressure, change the digestive process, boost glucose levels in the bloodstream. Once the crisis passes, these body systems usually return to normal. At least that's what they're supposed to do. Another set of body systems, body functions, of course, is the musculoskeletal system, which also responds under stress when muscles tense up. The contraction of the muscles for long periods of time can trigger things like tension headaches, migraines, and various musculoskeletal conditions. Obviously, that's not desirable. What you want is for the stress to come and enable you to deal with the issue and then go away so that you can get back to normal. But it isn't always that way. And when the stress hangs around and the body system remains on hyper alert, then all kinds of nasty things can begin to happen. Let's take a look at this chart as a way of understanding how stress affects physical and mental health. Stressors can certainly be external. I mean by that things like the room is too cold, temperature. You see a grizzly bear with her cubs and she's chasing you, and you have some kind of an external threat here that you perceive to be dangerous. And the end result is that this external threat sends the body into a condition of stress. Stressors, of course, can also be internal. There can be things going on inside the body, everything ranging from not enough food or not enough water to a need for more blood sugar, or maybe there's a tumor, or you've been infected with some nasty bacteria or virus that's causing stress internally. Whether the stress comes from the outside or the inside, when the body perceives the stressor as a stressor and appraises it and says, yep, this is a stressor, all right, we need to do something about this, then the next response is for the body to move to a fight or flight sort of response. Sometimes people propose that there's another alternative in here, and that is the freeze response. The idea that it isn't necessary to fight against it or to run away from it. You might also freeze up, kind of the way a fawn, a baby deer freezes, or a baby rabbit freezes when something dangerous comes around, in an effort to try to pass unnoticed. Actual physiological changes take place within the body to enable the fight, flight, freeze response to be effective. So, for example, extra blood is pumped to the muscles so that you can fight hard. The body's clotting factors go up. So if by any chance you're injured, your blood has an increased tendency to clot. You can see immediately that that would be a really good thing if you get clawed by a grizzly bear, but it's a really bad thing if your arteries are already half clogged up with cholesterol plaques. So you really don't, some of these things are designed to save your life in the immediate crisis, but if these things hang around very long, or if they happen very often, they can be life-threatening. The result of the body's perception and appraisal is the beginning of this stress reaction that we were talking about a little bit earlier. The hypothalamus pituitary axis is aroused, and this results in an acute hyperarousal of the body systems. Blood pressure goes up, heart rate goes up. And again, you can see that these are good things short term, but you really don't want your blood pressure to be up all the time. That's not a good idea. Now, what's supposed to happen at this point is that the threat is supposed to be dealt with. Something's supposed to happen that reduces or eliminates the threat. And if that happens, then the stress reaction returns to its lower normal levels. Sometimes, though, there really isn't any effective action that can be taken. And when that's the case, then instead of actually doing something to deal with the thing that caused the stress, we sort of eat the stress. It becomes internalized, and we find ourselves then feeling stressed out. We find ourselves feeling like life is not good. And this happens over and over and over again. Then we build up a pile of internalized stress, and we find ourselves in a state of chronic hyperarousal. This state of chronic hyperarousal can be characterized by some physical symptoms and signs like high blood pressure, heart arrhythmias, for example, where the heart itself simply becomes irritated and irritable, and it doesn't take very much to set it off doing things that it doesn't normally want to do, ranging from PVCs to tachycardias to stuff like that. Sleep disorders, headaches, backaches, anxiety. All of these things are things that you don't want to be a part of your life, and they shouldn't be a part of your life. But living with stress, living in a state of chronic stress, hyperarousal, having internalized the stress rather than being able to deal with it out there someplace, creates all these organic physical conditions. The result here is that people are so uncomfortable with this state of chronic hyperarousal that they need to do something with it. And so they try to cope somehow. They try to reduce the stress in their lives and eliminate the discomfort that they're feeling in all of this. And so they begin to try to cope, but oftentimes they don't cope very well. And so they start doing what we call maladaptive coping. This is coping that doesn't really work very well. Sometimes people will engage in behaviors like working really hard, and maybe avoiding the family, or just trying to work so hard that they can forget about the things that are causing stress in their lives, or maybe working so hard that they think they can insulate themselves from the things that are causing stress in their lives. Maybe they become hyperactive, like the guy who jumps on his horse at the alarm and gallops off in all directions at once. Maybe we engage in things like overeating or overdrinking. There can also be substance dependency on alcohol or drugs, or even food for that matter. And all these maladaptive coping behaviors produce ultimately a breakdown because they are clearly not good for us. And so the kinds of things that happen over here are things like physical exhaustion. We just are so tired we can hardly put one foot in front of another. Psychological exhaustion. We just can't deal with it anymore. Burnout. We're working harder and enjoying it less. We don't want to continue doing it anymore. Depression. We're just so sad and so blue, and we have no energy, and we know some of the things that we ought to do, but those are the very things that we least want to do. And then some of the biggies like heart attack or a stroke or cancer. These are consequences of the maladaptive coping that is trying to deal with the stress, the chronic hyperarousal that's taking place in a person's life, but isn't doing it in a healthy way. The result of all of this stuff is that the physical and psychological factors begin to themselves become stressors on the inside of the body. So even if things calm down on the outside, the person now has created a whole set of stressors on the inside. Overweight, perhaps, poor physical conditioning, high blood pressure, heart arrhythmias, whatever they might be. And this in turn creates the whole perception of stress and problems, and then begins to generate the same kind of issues over again. And so this becomes kind of a positive feedback loop where round and round you go, and it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. What can be done about it? Are we just doomed to deal with this in our complex society? Or is there actually something that we can do to help adapt to the stresses in our lives in a way that's healthy instead of unhealthy? Well, there are some things that we can do. Dr. Albert Ellis tells about 3 things that we can do. He calls them the ABCs, and he says the A is we actually can deal with the activating event of our stress by saying no to it. That is to say, we don't have to say yes to everything that everybody asks us to do. It's okay to say no. It's okay to say my life is too full right now. I'm too stressed. I'd love to do that for you, but I just can't. And so there are some stressors in life that simply can be avoided if we will simply learn how to use that 2-letter word no effectively. Another thing that we can do, Dr. Ellis says, is to change our beliefs about the things that are causing us stress. For example, some people believe that they have to get an A in school in order to be worthwhile human beings, and maybe that isn't true. So if they could change their belief about that and come to the idea that it's okay to have a B or even a C, it still means that you're a worthwhile human being, and you might experience a whole lot less stress in life if you were okay with a B instead of an A. So if you could change your beliefs about it, maybe there's somebody in your life that's causing you a great deal of stress, Maybe you're really worried about that person because you seek their approval and you think you really need it. But maybe your beliefs are wrong. Maybe it doesn't really matter what this person thinks about you. Maybe it's perfectly okay if they don't like you. Or maybe you even have the wrong idea about how they feel about you. I can remember times in my life when I thought somebody really doesn't like me, only to find out that they didn't even know who I was. They simply were reacting to something else altogether and had nothing to do with me. We tend to personalize these things, and if we only had an idea of how everybody else is kind of personalizing everything that comes to them too, we'd realize that so many people are not reacting to us at all. Then, of course, there is the final item here, which Dr. Ellis calls consequences. In other words, this is the consequence of the activating event and our beliefs about the activating event, and this is the place where we actually feel the stress. And we can do something about it. If we can't kind of say no to the stress, if we can't change what we think about the stress, then perhaps we can change the way the stress affects us. We can do that by finding activities that are good for people who are experiencing stress. One of those, for example, is exercise. So a person could start to exercise more, and by exercising could actually burn up some of the stress in his or her life. Eating well is another way of effectively dealing with stress in your life. That can make a huge difference in how well your brain functions and whether or not you perceive stress as being as dangerous and bad as it was. Then there's another way, and that is to simply practice some relaxation exercises and some different ways of relating to life. This would suggest that instead of going this way, it might be possible to go this way instead, and to choose a different way of relating to stress, a different way of responding to the stressors in our lives. A lot of people have discovered that they tend to live life either in the past, feeling bad about things that have happened, or in the future, dreading things that might happen. And neither regret nor worry is very productive, but they do tend to produce a lot of increased stress in our lives. If instead we could focus on the moment and live in the moment, we'd probably experience less stress. Another thing that happens to us is that we tend to live life sort of mindlessly. Maybe you've had the experience of driving along in your car and all of a sudden thinking, wait a minute, where am I? I'm not anywhere near where I had planned to go. I've been driving mindlessly. Or maybe you've had the experience of reading a book and suddenly you say, what have I been reading? I've just read a whole chapter and I have no idea what in the world I read. Or maybe you've eaten a meal and you have no idea what you're eating. You're so preoccupied and distracted that you aren't even aware of what it is that you're putting into your mouth. We tend to live life mindlessly much of the time. And some of this exacerbates our stress. That is to say, at the very least, it doesn't help our stress. So one of the things that we can do is to practice something that some folks have called mindfulness as an opposite to mindlessness. To try to live life mindfully, that is to say, fully aware of what's going on in the moment and being in the moment so that when we eat, we really understand what we're doing and we enjoy our food and we taste every taste and we take our time. And when we're talking to somebody, we're fully present with them and really listening to what they're saying. We're not trying to think about what we're going to say when they finally shut up, or we're not thinking about how we could get away from this person or how boring they are. We are fully present to that individual. We give them the amazing gift of love, which is listening. Or maybe when we're doing something, we're really doing that thing instead of trying to multitask and do two or three things at once. By the way, studies show that multitasking really isn't very effective. So with mindfulness, we are attempting to change our perception and our appraisal of what it is that's happened to us so that we can change our action. So that instead of coping in maladaptive ways, we can cope in adaptive ways, in ways that actually are good and helpful and healthy, and that actually accomplish what it is that we want to accomplish. And these are ways that actually reduce stress and help us to live life in a better, healthier way.